Okay, thank you. And it gives me great pleasure today to be able to speak to this motion because after almost 6 years in this place, I'm incredibly frustrated at the lack of seriousness that the two major parties take when it comes to dealing with significant issues that concern the Australian people. They are sick and tired of watching the circus down here. And it's interesting now that I'm an independent, people first, the only senator for people first, but party all the same. I sit here and watch the clown show that goes on and the juvenile behaviour between the two major parties. And the Australian people deserve better than what they're getting. I mean, this week we've had a focus on issues that aren't of great concern to the Australian people. We've had next to no discussion or debate or any legislation that attempts to deal with the major issue in this problem, which is cost of living. Cost of living, housing, cost of energy. Yes, I know that the Labor Party want to deal with the cost of energy by providing subsidies to build hydrogen energy, which is only going to be very, very expensive. We've got cheap black coal in the ground that is much, much cheaper. But rather than do that, we're going to go down some rabbit hole of green hydrogen, as if that's ever going to work. Okay? We've got an immigration crisis. Neither of the two major parties want to get serious about immigration in this country. If you want to get serious about immigration, we need to repeal many of the laws that were brought in by the Hawke-Keating government in the 1980s. And we are only weeks away from the next election, the campaign for the next election being called, and the Australian people have no idea what the policies of the major parties are, because the major parties aren't interested in solutions. They are only interested in power. And yet again, just today, we've seen laws passed that are going to censor free speech. There's no definition of violence in regards to this free speech. I mean, it's the police force. The policing in this country is dealt with by the state, by the states. There's nothing in Section 51 that deals with the federal government dealing with violence. The definition of a terrorism symbol, no one knows what that means. Heaven knows what that's going to be in the future, how that is going to be used against people who want to express an opinion. We're going to end up, I know, and if you add those laws brought in today on top of the online safety bill and the misinformation, disinformation laws, okay, we don't know what we can say anymore. And this is typical of the two major parties. When I come down here, I want to provide solutions. I want to put forward bills that are going to deal with cost of living, deal with energy prices, deal with housing, deal with the immigration issue, and I want to get the government out of people's lives. I want to get them out of the bedroom. I want to get them out of the family home. I want to get them out of the corporate boardroom. I want to get them out of the doctor's waiting room. I want them out of the classroom. But when we come down here, all we ever get is the major parties trying to impose more control. Now, I've got to point out there's a lot of good people in the major parties. The old Labor Party, once upon a time was the dominant faction were the blue-collar workers of the Labor Party. And that's okay, because this country is built and it belongs to the battlers. Okay, and we've got to look after our workers. Same for the Liberal Party. Small business. Small business is also the backbone of this country. The little guy is the backbone of this country, whether it's the worker or the small business. Okay, and that's the great thing with People First. We will put the people first, and we will hold either big government or big corporations to account. We don't care if it's public or private, because we know that you just can't trust big organisations. Because my time in these big organisations, I'll tell you what, it's always the yes men. It's always the little toadies that climb to the top. If you speak out, if you want to push back, you push to the side. I know. That's what happened to me in the Liberal Party. When I stood up for the vaccine injured, what happened to me? Oh, we've got to get rid of Rennick. We can't control him. We can't control him. So what do? Rather than go in and actually fight for the people injured by the vaccine, you just remove the messenger. Remove the messenger and protect Big Pharma and all those industries that made a killing out of the COVID hysteria. And here we are, 3 years into this parliament, and can I say, this term has been dominated by two issues. The first 18 months was all about the voice, which was one way of segregating the people and fighting each other. The second way to do it has been all about anti-Semitism and what's going on in Israel. These issues do not belong here in this country. Okay? These issues are all emotive issues that should be not dealt with in a manner that have been and we've seen the Liberal Party this week engage in disgusting inflammatory behaviour in order to stir everything up. You know, the whole idea that, you know, somehow Anthony Albanese is responsible for these so-called explosives in the caravan, and the whole, oh, you know, when did he find out and why didn't he tell us? You know, like, with all due respect, he wouldn't have a clue because it's being conducted by the New South Wales Police Force. They're the ones responsible for this. And some of the stories and the posturing going around this is a distraction. It's a deliberate distraction because the Liberal Party don't want to talk about their policies. They've only got one business policy so far, and that's a $20,000 tax deduction for entertainment for businesses with a turnover of up to $10 million, and it's only temporary for 2 years. Well, let me tell you, if that's the best the Liberal Party have got, we're going to see more of the same under a Dutton government that we saw under the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government, where they didn't deal with tax reform. And I'm going to hold this against the Liberal Party because as Secretary of the Finance Backbench Committee for 5 years, you know, I pushed a lot of ideas. I pushed a lot of tax reform when we were stuck down here on weekends because of COVID. I'd called meetings about, you know, tax policy, and a few of my former colleagues did turn up on Saturday afternoons. I had hour-long meetings, you know, went for hours most of the Saturday afternoon with the former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, and none of these policies that I have suggested have ever been implemented. And if these people were really serious, if these two major parties were really serious about tax reform in this country, they could implement them, because the policies I'm recommending here are policies that are actually going to tax foreigners more and Australians less. I mean, this is like the biggest free kick you can ever get, and all you've got to do is lower income tax for the hard-working Australians out there. But yet the two major parties, you come in here, 80 or 90% of what goes on in this place is nothing but juvenile bickering between two major parties. There's next to no government business, and when there is government business, it's always more control, like we saw today with the hate speech bill that's designed to censor free speech. Where's the actual genuine bills that's going to bring in greater efficiency in this country, especially in the government, that looks at actually reforming and streamlining the bureaucracy? There is none of it. If anything, it's quite the opposite, where we end up, you know, introducing a new agency, and we saw that this week with the Environment Positive Bill, a Nature Positive Bill, where there was now Labor want to bring in a bill that's actually going to create a new independent department. That is the last thing we need in this country, is another independent department, especially with the environment, because at the end of the day the environment isn't even a responsibility of the federal government under Section 51. The only reason why we have a federal environment department was because Bob Hawke went to the High Court in 1983 under the Franklin Dam decision and basically said we are going to use the foreign treaties power to override the plenary powers of the states when it comes to dealing with the environment. Now, I'm pretty sure when our founding forefathers wrote the Constitution and they said that the federal government should have powers over foreign treaties, they never intended for that power to override the plenary powers of the states. But because the federal government, because they're linked in through all these treaties, now have control, and there's treaties dealing with the environment, they've now established a federal environment department. One of the many duplication of environment departments we have in this country: education, health, energy, water, and the environment, just to name a few, and there's a whole raft of others. So, yet again, we've got this debacle this week where all we're doing is looking at adding more bureaucracy and censoring free speech and subsidising green hydrogen. Now, it just beggars belief, and I can't believe you guys, the Labor Party's behind in the polls. I mean, I didn't rate Anthony Albanese all that highly, but I did rate Labor as a political machine, and you guys are completely out of touch with reality. You're out here chasing these unicorns of climate change and, you know, all these wonderful woke ideas, but you know, and they might work when you don't have a cost of living crisis. But when people are struggling with mortgages and 14 interest rate rises, which, by the way, isn't the fault of the Labor Party. I know the Liberal Party have done a very good job of pinning all that on you, but it was actually a result of the reckless spending throughout COVID that's caused that, and then 40 years of slow decline in productivity. People don't want to hear about, fancy woke ideas. They want to know how you're going to implement solutions that are actually going to solve their cost of living prices, because there are people going broke in this country. There are people that are having to sell their houses. They're either having to move back home with mum or dad, or they're actually ending up on the streets in tents. And we can't have that, right? I mean, luckily, it's all right if you live in Sydney and Melbourne, you can sell up and probably move to Queensland, get a house for half the price and then at least have some money to live on. But for many people in Queensland and that, their houses, they can't sell their houses and move into something lower because, especially if they're from regional Queensland. So we need to be dealing with this problem, and we need serious structural monetary reform in this country. Yet again, one of the big mistakes of Keating was he made the RBA independent. Monetary policy, along with taxation policy, are the two most important issues that government should be dealing with, and we have outsourced monetary policy to an unelected RBA that refuses to hand over the minutes they have of the meetings they have with the International Bank of Settlements, and instead they have sat there and they're doing nothing about 14 interest rate rises. And let me tell you, changing the price of money is a speculative measure. Mucking around with the price of interest rates on the first Tuesday of every month, or 6 meetings now a year, is not dealing with the underlying problem, is that we have a lack of infrastructure in this country, we have a lack of baseload energy, we have a lack of decent dams. We haven't built hardly a dam in this country in the last 50 years. We haven't built enough roads, rail, things like that. If you want a solution to this, we need to start building more infrastructure, and we fund it via an infrastructure bank. I've spoken about monetary policy and the need to reform monetary policy many times in this chamber, and of course we get nothing. We get nothing. And we have this crazy— we need to change the standing orders as well. There is too much time in this chamber. We need to get rid of take note. We don't really need 2 MPIs a day. We don't really need any MPIs, but let's take it back from 1 hour's worth of MPI to half an hour of MPI. Those sort of things need to go. They're just arguing for the sake of arguing, and we need to give the government more time to actually do business, because yet again today we've seen more bills guillotined. We saw 30 bills guillotined in the last sitting week at the end of the year, and these were very, very important bills. I never got a chance to speak on the shuffling of the RBA boards and the fact that we now got 2 RBA boards. I mean, that's the typical solution to our monetary problem, is one bureaucratic department couldn't solve it, so now we're going to create another bureaucratic department. So we're now going to have 2 boards to sit around and shuffle the price of money, rather than getting more people out there in the workforce on the front lines, more people back on the tools, actually building dams and power stations. If you want to deal with the productivity crisis, and our productivity crisis and our inflation crisis is actually not caused by too much demand, well, if you put aside the immigration issue, it's actually caused by a lack of supply. And it's a lack of supply because we haven't built enough infrastructure in this country in the last 50 years. We can blame John Button for that, the former Victorian Labor senator that introduced the Button plan, because he said that Australia can no longer compete in manufacturing, so we're just going to let it all go offshore. Well, how's that turning out for us? 40 years later, we've got a whole generation of graduates from universities that are broke and brainwashed, feeling sorry for themselves, instead of getting out of school when they're 15 or 16, getting an apprenticeship, getting on the tools, learning the meaning of hard work. It's wealth for toil. It is wealth for toil in this country. It is wealth for getting on the tools and building infrastructure. And it's certainly not wealth for the games and the circus that goes on in this chamber week in, week out, where you guys, the 2 major parties, are just bickering between yourselves. So I say to you guys, get busy. Come in here next week with some genuine solutions in regards to monetary policy, tax, immigration and energy, and stop fighting amongst yourselves.
Authorised G. Rennick People First Chermside.